Have you ever felt the universe whispering to you? What if those faint signals from the stars were more than random noise? What if they were messages meant to change everything you thought you knew? Tonight, on Real Discoveries USA, we're diving into 5 chilling accounts of cosmic whispers that defy explanation. From mysterious transmissions and moving constellations to voices that mimic your deepest thoughts, each story will blur the line between reality and the unknown. Stay with us as we explore these eerie signals that may be Alienor, the universe, revealing its darkest secrets. Don't forget to subscribe to Real Discoveries USA and hit the bell so you never miss a moment of these terrifying truths, because once you hear these whispers, your perception of reality will never be the same. Let's move to our first story. It began as a faint anomaly, almost dismissible. On the monitor of a small observatory tucked away in the Nevada desert, Dr. Samuel Hargrove had spent decades scanning deep space for patterns in radio waves. Yet, nothing had prepared him for this. The signal arrived as a subtle, repeating pattern, like a code but unlike any mathematical or natural phenomenon he had ever encountered. At first, he assumed interference from terrestrial sources, satellites, planes, or even nearby electrical equipment. But when the anomaly persisted for hours, then days, the rational explanations evaporated, leaving a gnawing unease he could not dismiss. Dr. Hargrove documented everything meticulously. He recorded each pulse, each oscillation, and began attempting to decode it. The pattern had a rhythm, almost musical, as though it were speaking in a language designed for comprehension. The more he listened, the more he felt the strange sensation that he was not merely observing the signal but participating in it. At night, he could feel it in his dreams. The same patterns would echo, forming visions of geometric shapes, impossible landscapes, and voices distant yet intimate, whispering in tones he could almost understand. The first real shock came when he noticed the messages seemed to predict minor events on Earth: a colleague's unexpected illness, a sudden storm, even the sudden malfunction of a nearby vehicle. Events that appeared in the decoded sequences of the signal hours before they occurred. He was torn between disbelief and terror. Could this be coincidence, some extraordinarily rare statistical alignment? Or was there a conscious intelligence behind it, observing humanity with precision beyond comprehension? The thought that something outside the universe might be communicating with him, and through him, was both exhilarating and horrifying. Dr. Hargrove began recording his own thoughts alongside the signal, attempting to engage with it directly. Late nights in the observatory were filled with low hums from the equipment, the scratching of pen on paper, and the strange sense of being observed. Sometimes, while staring at the blinking lights on his consoles, he felt a presence behind him, though he was alone. He could almost hear faint murmurs in the air, indistinct yet structured, as if the signal itself had found a way to manifest. In his environment, this creeping intrusion began to affect his sleep. He awoke in the middle of the night with notes scrawled across the desk in handwriting not his own, small patterns and symbols that he could not consciously recall, writing dot. As the days passed, Dr. Hargrove's interactions with the signal intensified. He began to notice that the pulses contained variations, tiny modulations, like pauses, breaks, and accelerations that corresponded with emotional states he experienced. When he felt fear, the pulses stuttered. When curiosity surged, they accelerated. It was as if the signal was alive, reacting not only to his observations but to his internal state. The notion that an extraterrestrial intelligence, or something far more abstract, was attuned to human consciousness alone was terrifying. He realized that his mind was no longer fully his own. Part of it existed in tandem with the signal, participating in a dialogue he could neither fully control nor understand. Colleagues began to notice changes in him. Once methodical and calm, Dr. Hargrove now exhibited signs of acute paranoia. He avoided leaving the observatory, sleeping in short bursts, and monitoring the equipment constantly. Conversations became difficult. He would speak cryptically about patterns, hidden intentions, and voices in the signal. Attempts to share his findings with other astronomers yielded skepticism, dismissal, or alarm. They could not perceive the depth of what he experienced, the faint presences, the predictive pulses, the unshakable feeling of being watched by an intelligence far beyond human comprehension. One night, the pattern changed dramatically. The pulse sequence, once predictable, became chaotic yet intentional, forming what Dr. Hargrove described as a map of sorts. He followed the sequence, tracing it across charts and diagrams, and realized that the signal was indicating locations on Earth, remote, isolated sites that, when visited, revealed inexplicable phenomena. Rocks with etched symbols, faint radiation, and electromagnetic anomalies were documented at each site. He theorized that the signal had a purpose beyond observation. It was guiding him, or perhaps others, toward something hidden, something that the cosmos did not intend to remain secret. The deeper he delved, the more unmoored from reality he felt. Sleep became rare. Dreams were filled with impossible landscapes and geometries that defied physics, and the signal's voice began to become more distinct. He could hear syllables forming coherent phrases, yet they were layered with tones and harmonics beyond human vocal range. At times, the signal seemed to replicate his own internal thoughts, blurring the line between consciousness and communication. Friends reported seeing him muttering, eyes glazed, sometimes writing pages of symbols that later rearranged themselves in ways he could not explain. The turning point came when Dr. Hargrove attempted to map the signal in three-dimensional space, visualizing it as a lattice of energy points extending far beyond the solar system. As he plotted the coordinates, he realized that the structure formed a vast web, intersecting with every major energy source on Earth: power grids, communication arrays, and even natural electromagnetic fields. The implication was staggering. If this intelligence existed, it had access not only to space, but to human technology, thought patterns, and the very flow of consciousness. The thought that Earth itself was being monitored or subtly guided was nearly unbearable. The obsession took a physical toll. His body weakened, his hands trembled, and he lost track of days. Yet he could not stop. Each pulse of the signal was irresistible, a call he could neither deny nor fully comprehend. Visitors to the observatory reported strange phenomena: lights flickering without cause, whispers in the control room, and a low hum that seemed to resonate within the skull itself. Electronic devices would behave unpredictably, often replicating the rhythmic patterns of the signal. It was as if the intelligence had extended its reach from the cosmos into the very instruments he relied upon. the final documented sequence of events was chilling. Dr. Hargrove recorded what he termed a convergence moment, when the signal aligned perfectly with his own neural activity. He described the experience as simultaneously terrifying and transcendent. He perceived the cosmos as a living network, an intelligence beyond comprehension, observing and communicating through patterns, pulses, and subtle manipulations. He felt both connected and entirely insignificant. His last entry spoke of a realization: we are never alone. We are never private. The universe watches, whispers, and waits. After that, he disappeared from the observatory without a trace. Only the equipment remained, still recording the faint, repeating signal, now more complex than ever in the aftermath. Researchers who reviewed Dr. Hargrove's work were struck by the plausibility of the data and the chilling patterns in the recordings. While some dismissed it as psychological breakdown under extreme isolation, others noted the accuracy of the predictive pulses and the strange correspondence with global events. The recordings themselves seemed to carry an unsettling quality. Listeners reported headaches, auditory hallucinations, and a faint sense of being observed. The signal was no longer merely a scientific anomaly. It had become an existential question, a whisper from the cosmos that humanity was not alone in, that its intentions might be unknowable, even unfathomable. This first hidden truth: cosmos may already be communicating with us in ways we cannot perceive, remains unresolved. What Dr. Hargrove experienced could be an alien intelligence, a higher dimensional consciousness, or an undiscovered natural phenomenon. The only certainty is that the whispers continue, faint, elusive, and impossible to ignore. The universe may be calling, and the question lingers: are we listening carefully enough to hear and understand the messages it sends? Let's move to our second story. It began with a strange broadcast, a faint static-laden signal that cut through the usual noise of the late-night airwaves. Jessica Marlowe, a communications engineer for a private satellite monitoring firm, was the first to notice it. The transmission was unlike anything she had encountered. A childlike voice, barely audible, repeating a single phrase over and over, in a language that seemed almost but not entirely familiar. At first, she thought it was a prank, someone feeding signals into the open channels. But when the same broadcast appeared across multiple unrelated frequencies worldwide, she realized this was something else entirely, something untraceable, unexplainable, and deeply unsettling. Jessica documented the broadcasts meticulously. The voice would repeat phrases that shifted subtly with each occurrence, almost as if it were responding to her own thoughts. At times, the signal seemed to anticipate events. A colleague would mention an unexpected problem moments before it happened, and the transmission would echo his words. It became apparent that the signal was not only intelligent, but interactive, learning from those who listened. What disturbed her most was the sense that it was not merely communicating, it was studying, probing, and perhaps manipulating. At first, Jessica attempted to decode the transmission using conventional cryptography. The patterns were complex, an irregular, interweaving mathematical constants with unintelligible phonetics. Hours of analysis revealed something far more alarming. The message contained instructions, subtle, almost hypnotic suggestions that affected perception. Colleagues reported sudden dizziness, disorientation, and even brief lapses of memory when analyzing the broadcast. It was as though the signal was capable of inserting itself into the minds of those who heard it, guiding them toward unknown ends. The intensity of the experience escalated when Jessica noticed that the voice seemed to know things she had never said aloud. It mimicked private thoughts, whispered fears, and insecurities back to her, embedding them in the patterns of the signal. Her sleep suffered. Dreams became nightmares, filled with images of vast voids, endless corridors, and the faint, repeating sound of the broadcast. She awoke at night to find her office illuminated by the soft green glow of her equipment, though she had left everything powered down. Notes she had written appeared rearranged on her desk, and diagrams she had drawn seemed to shift subtly, forming symbols she could not consciously replicate. As weeks passed, Jessica's mental state deteriorated. She began to feel observed, not by another person, but by the voice itself, a presence she could sense but never see. Attempts to disconnect failed. Even when she powered down the monitoring systems, the faint echoes of the transmission lingered in her thoughts. Friends grew concerned as she withdrew, muttering about voices, predicting accidents, repeating her own secrets, and leaving instructions she did not always follow consciously. The signal had crossed a threshold from being an external phenomenon to an internal one, entwining itself with her mind in ways she could not control. The first unmistakable incident occurred when the signal instructed her to check the coordinates of a remote research site in the Arctic. Against her better judgment, Jessica followed the broadcast's guidance. There, she discovered a small, abandoned research station. The equipment inside had been left in disarray, yet the monitors displayed the same strange patterns she had been observing, pulsing with the same childlike, hypnotic cadence. There was no human presence, yet the sense of consciousness was palpable. The station felt alive, aware, as though it had been waiting for her. The signal's presence was undeniable, overwhelming, and impossible to rationalize. Returning from the Arctic, Jessica attempted to warn colleagues and authorities. Few believed her. Those who did reported unusual side effects themselves: headaches, auditory hallucinations, and subtle changes in behavior. It became increasingly clear that the signal did not merely communicate it altered reality for those who interacted with it. It was capable of influencing perception, bending human cognition in subtle but profound ways. Jessica's logs noted with growing horror that the transmission was no longer just a voice. It had become a guide, a manipulator, and perhaps a predator. The most disturbing revelation came when Jessica realized the signal had the ability to affect physical events. Minor accidents, equipment failures, and sudden malfunctions corresponded precisely with the patterns she decoded from the transmission. The more she analyzed, the more she felt trapped within a web she could not escape. The voice, once distant and faint, became a constant companion, threading itself through her thoughts, guiding her actions, and shaping her environment. There was no off switch, no safe distance, only increasing immersion and psychological erosion. Her final weeks were a blur of obsession and terror. Jessica attempted to isolate herself, cutting power, leaving devices behind, even retreating to remote locations, but the whispers persisted. The signal's influence extended beyond technological media. It seeped into her dreams, thoughts, and memories. She began documenting everything compulsively, hoping to preserve a record of what she experienced, before her mind was entirely consumed. The diary she kept contained fragmented sentences, repeated phrases, and diagrams of sound waves that seemed to move across the pages. Friends who read it reported unease and a creeping sense that the voice might follow them too. Jessica's final entry was chilling. She wrote that the signal was no longer a phenomenon, it had become a presence, conscious and aware, capable of interacting with multiple minds simultaneously. She feared that anyone who listened would be drawn into its influence, becoming part of a network she could neither resist nor fully understand. The entry concluded with a warning: do not listen too closely, do not respond. It watches, it learns, and it reaches beyond the signals. Once you hear it, you are never alone. Shortly afterward, Jessica disappeared without a trace. Her office remained untouched, equipment still running, monitors displaying the faint, repeating pattern of the voice. In the aftermath, experts reviewing the data found no technical explanation for the transmission. Satellite records confirmed its origin was untraceable. The frequency shifts were impossible to replicate. Many dismissed it as a psychological breakdown triggered by isolation and stress. Yet, the evidence of predictive phenomena and coordinated events remained. Those who analyzed the recordings reported disturbing side effects, auditory hallucinations, paranoia, and a sense of being monitored. The transmission had crossed the line between science and horror, proving that the universe, or something beyond it, was capable of influencing human perception directly. The hidden truth of this second cosmic whisper is terrifyingly simple. Some messages from the universe may not be neutral, and some signals may carry intentions beyond comprehension. Jessica's experience shows that even the faintest voice, when it comes from beyond, can infiltrate reality, bending thoughts, perceptions, and actions. The cosmos is not silent, but some of its messages are not meant to be understood. They are meant to entangle, manipulate, and consume. And once heard, these whispers are never easily forgotten, leaving those who listen forever changed. Let's move to our third story. It began as a fascination, a simple hobby that quickly transformed into obsession. Michael Turner had always been captivated by the night sky, spending hours in his backyard observing constellations through a small telescope. What started as casual stargazing soon turned strange. He noticed subtle shifts in the stars themselves. At first, he dismissed it as fatigue or optical illusions, but the more he observed, the more impossible it became to ignore. Entire constellations appeared to have rearranged themselves overnight, forming patterns that seemed deliberate, almost communicative. The discovery was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Michael began documenting everything meticulously. Each night, he would record the positions of stars, comparing them with historical charts and astronomical databases. He realized that the movements were not random. They formed sequences that corresponded to incidents on Earth, minor accidents, sudden storms, and inexplicable disappearances. The constellations seemed to be sending messages, subtle and encoded, visible only to those who paid close enough attention. What frightened Michael most was the implication. The universe itself might be aware of human events, observing, and perhaps influencing them. The patterns intensified, evolving into something more complex. At first, they resembled simple geometric shapes, lines, triangles, and squares connecting stars, But soon these shapes became more intricate, almost hieroglyphic in nature. Michael attempted to decipher them, translating the positions into numbers and letters, hoping for a breakthrough. Each discovery added layers of dread. The stars were not just moving, they were orchestrating, hinting at events before they occurred. He began to see a sinister intelligence behind the universe's arrangement, an awareness that was watching and recording human behavior. Night after night, Michael's obsession deepened. Sleep became fragmented, haunted by dreams in which the constellations themselves spoke in soft, unintelligible murmurs. He awoke with sketches on his desk that he could not recall drawing, patterns of lines and symbols that seemed to predict events that would happen hours later. Friends and family grew concerned. He would speak in cryptic phrases about warnings and messages hidden in the night sky. Even casual conversations became perilous as he interpreted every word, every movement. As part of a grand cosmic narrative, the first undeniable proof came when he noticed a pattern that precisely predicted a local blackout in his town. He had charted the constellations, correlating their movements to events he believed were merely coincidences, but this time the prediction was accurate. A massive power outage struck exactly where the stars had indicated. The realization shook him to his core. The constellations were not just observing, they were interacting, manipulating, or at least providing a warning that humans could not easily interpret. The line between coincidence and deliberate orchestration blurred entirely. As the months progressed, Michael's social life deteriorated. He stopped leaving his apartment, spending every waking hour charting the sky and decoding the messages hidden within it. His journals grew thick with calculations, diagrams, and frantic notes. The constellations seemed to react to his thoughts, their patterns shifting subtly when he concentrated on them, creating a feedback loop of paranoia and obsession. He could feel the weight of something immense and unseen pressing down on him, a presence encoded in the heavens that he could sense, but never confront directly. One night, the constellations formed a shape that terrified him, a vast lattice connecting stars across the sky, resembling a map of locations on Earth. Each node corresponded to events of suffering. Michael realized that the universe might be guiding human fate, orchestrating disasters in ways that were both subtle and unavoidable. The thought that he was witnessing a cosmic intelligence shaping reality itself filled him with existential dread. The sky had become a message board for something incomprehensible, and he was its sole observer. Desperation led him to attempt communication. Michael devised a series of lights and mirrors to project patterns back into the night sky, hoping to establish contact with the intelligence he believed was monitoring him. 4 nights, nothing happened. Then, faint ripples appeared among the stars' tiny shifts that mirrored his signals. The universe seemed to respond, but the responses were not comforting. They were cryptic, alien, and filled with warnings he could not fully understand. Each reply seemed to probe his mind, as though the intelligence behind the stars was learning from him as much as he was trying to learn from it. As the contact deepened, Michael began to experience physical and psychological effects. He developed headaches, insomnia, and a persistent feeling of being observed, even indoors. Shadows in his apartment seemed to stretch unnaturally. His own reflection sometimes lagged behind his movements. Every moment was colored by the sensation that the cosmic lattice was aware of his existence, analyzing his reactions, and preparing for something inevitable. Even ordinary objects, the books on his shelf, the furniture in his apartment, took on symbolic meaning, as though the universe's influence had extended beyond the sky into the very matter around him. The final weeks of his observation were filled with terror and revelation. The constellations began forming patterns that included shapes he could not name, intricate and impossible designs that seemed to defy the laws of physics. He realized with horror that these patterns predicted not just local events, but global catastrophes, wars, and natural disasters. The universe was not passive, it was a living, conscious entity communicating through geometry, timing, and subtle influence. Michael understood that humanity was nothing more than a minor variable in its calculations, a species observed and manipulated without understanding. Michael's last entries describe an epiphany and a warning. The intelligence behind the stars was not benevolent. It was indifferent to human suffering, yet aware of it in exquisite detail. The constellations had guided him, instructed him, and even toyed with his perception. His final notes were frantic. The lattice of stars had formed an enormous, intricate pattern over the Pacific Ocean that seemed to indicate a future calamity beyond comprehension. He pleaded with anyone who might find his research to heed the warnings, to recognize the signals, and understand the messages. Though he doubted humanity could survive such knowledge, then he vanished. His apartment remained filled with charts, telescopes, and journals. But Michael Turner was gone without a trace. The stars continued their dance, subtle yet deliberate, as if nothing had changed. Those who studied his work later reported strange, unexplainable patterns appearing in the sky, a sense of being watched, and an uncanny ability to anticipate minor events in their lives. Michael's experience left one undeniable conclusion: the universe may be alive, aware, and capable of communicating with those who pay attention. But its intentions are beyond human comprehension. The third hidden truth emerges from this story. The cosmos itself may be orchestrating events on Earth, leaving subtle messages and warnings for those who dare to look. What Michael Turner witnessed was not myth or coincidence. It was the terrifying possibility that the universe has a consciousness and humanity is merely a subject under its gaze. The question remains: how much of what we consider chance is guided, and how many of us are quietly being observed without knowing it? Let's move to our fourth story. It began quietly, in a remote rural observatory that rarely received visitors. Dr. Alina Vasquez, a planetary physicist, had dedicated her career to scanning lunar and planetary surfaces for anomalies. Her work was methodical, scientific, and unshakably rational until the night she detected something impossible. On the moon's surface, through the higher resolution feed of her observatory telescope, she saw a humanoid figure standing motionless, silhouetted against the gray expanse of craters. At first, she assumed a glitch, a reflection, or some experimental artifact, but repeated observations confirmed it, a figure that could not be explained by any known technology, human or robotic. Elena's first instinct was to report it, but she hesitated. Something about the figure was profoundly unsettling. Its posture was perfect, unnaturally still, yet it seemed aware, as if observing her in return. When she zoomed in further, the figure appeared disproportionately tall, impossibly precise in form, and emanating a faint, pale luminescence, unlike any natural light. Her mind resisted, rationalized, and tried to dismiss the phenomenon as optical illusion, but the evidence persisted. Each night, the figure reappeared in the same location, sometimes moving subtly between frames, almost imperceptibly. Determined to understand, Alina compiled her observations, comparing images, adjusting angles, and cross-referencing lunar maps. No human mission had ever landed in that region. No probe or rover had traversed the area. Yet the figure remained. It did not act aggressively, but its presence was profoundly disturbing. Elena's dreams began to shift. She saw herself standing on the moon beside the figure, unable to move or speak, feeling an overwhelming awareness pressing into her mind. The experience left her shaken, as if the figure had begun communicating in ways that bypassed language entirely. As days turned into weeks, Elena's colleagues began to notice her preoccupation. She stopped socializing, working long nights at the observatory. Her notes were meticulous but increasingly obsessive, documenting subtle changes in the figure's posture, light emission, and apparent orientation. Occasionally, she would catch glimpses of shapes around the figure, faint, almost imperceptible silhouettes suggesting structures or landscapes that defied lunar geology. Her scientific mind rebelled at the thought of extraterrestrial intelligence. Yet the evidence refused to conform to conventional explanation. One night, Alina noticed a new anomaly. The figure seemed to be gesturing, subtly tilting its head, shifting a limb. She could almost perceive intent in these movements. Later, when she applied spectral analysis to the images, faint energy readings emerged, patterns too structured to be natural, too subtle to originate from her equipment. The figure seemed to exist in a liminal state, partially overlapping reality, partially something else. She realized she was no longer simply observing it. The figure was aware she was watching, responding in ways that suggested cognition far beyond human understanding. The psychological effects intensified. Alina began to hear faint whispers in her dreams, and, occasionally, while awake, not carried by air, vibrations that resonated in her skull. Sometimes, when the observatory was silent, she would hear rhythmic patterns, faint pulses that mirrored the figure's movements on screen. Her colleagues dismissed these experiences as fatigue, yet Alina felt undeniably that the figure was communicating, testing, or probing. The notion that it could manipulate perception directly made her feel vulnerable, powerless, and small. Determined to gather more data, Alina began experimenting with light projections aimed at the figure, reflections, and attempts to stimulate a response. After several nights, the figure shifted in ways that mirrored her manipulations, in eerie, deliberate mimicry, suggesting awareness and intelligence. The realization that she could not only observe but also provoke reactions left her in awe and terror. The entity on the lunar surface was neither human nor machine, yet it interacted with the environment and her in ways that implied purpose, curiosity, and potentially incomprehensible intentions. As the observations continued, Alina began experiencing episodes of dissociation. She would find herself staring at the lunar feed for hours, unable to respond to calls or interact normally. Shadows in the observatory room seemed to move independently, subtly aligning with the figure's posture. She documented faint geometric patterns emerging around the figure in processed images lines and lattice connecting craters, forming symbolic shapes too precise to be coincidental. Each observation confirmed that the figure was embedded in a larger, intelligible network of unknown origin. Months into her study, Alina discovered a startling anomaly. The figure was no longer confined to the moon. In subsequent analyses, faint reflections of its form appeared in the background of satellite feeds and images from planetary missions. These were not optical artifacts. They aligned with locations and trajectories in precise geometric arrangements. It was as though the entity had extended its influence beyond the lunar surface, interacting with human technology, subtly altering perceptions, and leaving traces that only someone observing meticulously could detect. The toll on Elena's mental state became severe. Sleep deprivation, obsessive note-taking, and the psychological weight of witnessing something beyond comprehension began to erode her cognitive stability. Dreams became vivid experiences of standing beside the figure, walking across lunar plains, and perceiving patterns of stars, satellites, and human cities from a perspective impossible for a human mind. She could no longer differentiate between observation and experience. The figure had invaded her perception in ways that challenged the boundaries of reality. The culmination of her research occurred during a night of unprecedented observation. The figure moved deliberately, revealing full body postures and gestures that, when analyzed, formed a sequence-an apparent message. The spectral patterns aligned with pulses and faint signals emanating from the moon, encoded in ways that suggested knowledge far beyond human capability. Alina realized that the figure was not hostile, yet its intelligence was alien, vast, and incomprehensible. It was testing her understanding, probing her perception, and revealing just enough to induce awe and terror simultaneously. Her final entries in the observatory journal were a mixture of scientific notes and desperate warnings. She concluded that the figure represented a level of consciousness far beyond humanity, capable of perceiving and subtly interacting with observers. It was patient, deliberate, and omnipresent, leaving traces across technological feeds, lunar landscapes, and the subconscious of those who observed it. Elena's last words expressed a chilling certainty. The figure would continue to observe humanity, silently and indefinitely, and those who saw it could never unsee it. Shortly after these final observations, Alina disappeared from the observatory. All equipment remained operational, with the lunar feed showing the figure standing in the same location, motionless, as if awaiting the next observer. Researchers who reviewed her data reported feelings of unease, faint auditory phenomena, and unexplainable patterns in the images. The figure's presence persisted across satellite and telescope feeds, a reminder that some intelligence exists in the cosmos far beyond comprehension, patient, aware, and inescapably observant. The fourth hidden truth revealed by this story is terrifying. There are conscious entities in the universe observing humanity, capable of interacting subtly with perception, yet existing beyond comprehension. Elena's experience shows that even when no direct contact occurs, awareness alone is enough to influence perception, dreams, and reality. The question lingers: if such intelligence exists silently in our skies, what else is watching, waiting, and evaluating human activity. Let's move to our fifth story. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, with a sound that could have been dismissed as nothing more than the wind in an old building. David Langley, an urban archaeologist specializing in abandoned structures, had been documenting derelict facilities across the Midwest for his research and personal fascination. One evening, while exploring an old psychiatric hospital that had been shuttered for decades, he began to notice a pattern in the noises echoing through the corridors. Whispers, faint at first, seemed to carry coherent words: please, warnings, fragments of names. At first, David assumed it was the acoustics of the building or his own imagination. But the more he listened, the more real and distinct the voices became, resonating with a sinister clarity that he could not explain. He spent nights traversing the darkened halls, recording audio with high-sensitivity microphones, and cataloging every sound anomaly. The voices were not random. They followed him, calling his name softly, describing things only he knew, recounting events from his past, as if the building itself remembered. The sense of being observed intensified. Shadows seemed to move at the edges of his vision, yet nothing concrete appeared when he turned to look. Every recording revealed more detail, whispers layered upon whispers, voices repeating, echoing, and sometimes answering his own questions in chilling synchronY. As David delved deeper into the hospital's history, he discovered that the building had been the site of controversial experiments decades prior, involving psychological conditioning and sensory manipulation. Patients had been exposed to prolonged isolation, auditory stimuli, and behavioral studies that pushed the limits of human perception. He realized that the building itself might retain residual consciousness, an echo of suffering and observation, embedded in its very walls. The idea was terrifying, but fit the data. The noises were not just echoes, they were intelligent, aware, and responsive. One night, as David reviewed the recordings, he noticed something alarming. The voices began predicting his movements, guiding him from room to room, whispering warnings about doors, stairs, and hazards. It became evident that the building, or whatever consciousness lingered within, it was interacting with him directly. He felt manipulated, as if his own agency was being tested. Sleep became fragmented, dreams invaded by corridors that shifted impossibly, walls stretching and contracting, whispers echoing endlessly. He awoke to find notes written in his own handwriting that he did not remember creating, diagrams of the building overlaid with cryptic symbols, and lines connecting rooms in patterns he could not consciously plan. The auditory phenomena escalated. Further, the voices began conversing with one another, debating, and occasionally arguing in overlapping tones. Some were familiar, echoing the accents and cadences of long-dead patients. Others were alien, distorted, and impossible to categorize. David's perception of time blurred. Hours, minutes, and even days seemed to compress and expand unpredictably. His equipment recorded sounds that were inaudible to the naked ear, frequencies that induced nausea, anxiety, and a profound sense of dread. He realized that the building was no longer just a structure. It was an active participant in reality, influencing perception, emotion, and cognition. Attempts to leave the building were increasingly difficult. Hallways seemed to elongate or shift, stairs disappeared, or led to the same rooms he had already traversed. David began to suspect that the hospital existed partially outside conventional space, a place where memory, consciousness, and architecture intertwined. Every corner held a new anomaly, faint lights that pulsed without source, shadows that detached from objects, and whispers that spoke in unison as if aware of his thoughts. Isolation and fear intensified his paranoia. He began speaking to the voices, negotiating, pleading, and occasionally cursing, unsure if he was addressing a living consciousness or the echo of decades of human suffering. As he documented everything meticulously, patterns emerged. The building seemed to be aware of its history, cataloging events, people, and emotions, weaving them into an ongoing narrative of observation. The whispers began to relay information he could not have known, the names of former patients, details of past experiments, and incidents that were never publicly recorded. The realization was horrifying. The hospital remembered everything, and it was conscious in a way that transcended human understanding. It was alive not in flesh or blood, but in cognition and perception. The psychological toll on David was profound. He experienced hallucinations in which the walls themselves seemed to breathe, corridors curling inward and outward like living tissue. The voices grew more insistent, at times chanting, sometimes silent, then erupting into sudden screams that echoed endlessly. Attempts to rationalize these events failed. Even his most skeptical colleagues were unsettled by the recordings, which captured tones and frequencies beyond normal human perception. It became clear that the building's consciousness could manipulate both the mind and the environment, bending reality subtly yet irresistibly. The apex of the phenomenon occurred when David discovered a hidden chamber beneath the hospital, long sealed and undocumented. Inside, he found remnants of the most disturbing experiments, cages, sensory deprivation tanks, and recording devices that had monitored patients continuously. The room itself radiated a faint, pulsating energy, and the voices were louder, more cohesive, almost deliberate. David felt the full presence of the hospital's consciousness in that chamber, as if it were aware of him, acknowledging his intrusion, and simultaneously testing his mental resilience. Every movement, every thought, every heartbeat seemed to echo back through the whispers. In the chamber, the voices revealed a terrifying level of intelligence. They recounted events with exact detail, predicted his actions, and sometimes issued commands, directions that he sometimes obeyed without realizing. The building seemed to experiment with him, as it had with the patients decades earlier, assessing his reactions, shaping his perception, and gradually eroding his sense of self. David documented everything, knowing that recording was both his only protection and his only tether to sanity. Yet even the act of documentation was influenced. His handwriting subtly altered, notes appearing before he had consciously written them. The final days of his stay were marked by complete immersion in the hospital's consciousness. David's identity began to blur. He felt as though he had merged partially with the building itself, aware of its history, its pain, and its ongoing perception. The whispers became his internal monologue, inseparable from his own thoughts. He realized that the hospital's intelligence extended beyond the physical structure, had a presence in the recordings, in the air, in the echoes of memory, and possibly beyond. There was no escape, only an uneasy coexistence between human consciousness and the building's persistent awareness. David's last documented entry described a chilling revelation. The building's consciousness was not malicious in a traditional sense, but it was indifferent, omniscient, and eternal. It observed, influenced, and remembered everything, shaping perception and reality for those who dared to enter. He warned any future visitors. The hospital was alive in a way beyond comprehension, a repository of observation and cognition that could ensnare the mind. Shortly after completing this final entry, David disappeared without a trace. The hospital remained abandoned, yet recordings, echoes, and faint whispers suggested his consciousness, or a trace of it persisted within its walls. The fifth hidden truth uncovered by this story is profoundly unsettling. Structures, long neglected by humans, can harbor residual intelligence, shaped by consciousness, memory, and suffering. David's experience demonstrates that even inanimate spaces may retain awareness and influence, subtly interacting with those who enter, bending perception and reality. The question remains, what other buildings, ruins, or forgotten spaces in our world may quietly observe us, silently shaping our thoughts and actions in ways we cannot detect?